Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. Today's story is about the 50 years nobody talks about, the recovery period after something so terrible that an entire civilization agreed to forget it. This is part 2 of the Lost Years testimony, continuing from where we left off in 2127, when the structure finally collapsed and released the absorbed consciousnesses back into their broken minds. Imagine remembering 50 years of life experience, but only 30 of it actually happened to you. The rest belongs to people who dissolved into your consciousness, whose memories feel as real as your own, whose voices grow louder every year until you can't remember which person you're supposed to be. That's what every survivor of the hunger lived with. That's what shaped everything about wasteland civilization, from why settlements stay small, to why the Brotherhood hoards knowledge, to why raiders reject all community bonds. The Lost Years didn't end when the structure fell. They ended when the last witnesses went feral and took the truth with them into madness. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. This entire script is narrated from the first-person perspective of a character from the Fallout universe. Their identity remains hidden throughout the story. After you've heard everything, try to guess which character is speaking in the comments below. The first person to guess correctly will have their comment pinned. I remember the exact moment I realized I was losing. Not the war, not my humanity, not even my mind in the traditional sense. I was losing the ability to distinguish between which memories were mine and which belonged to the 7 other consciousnesses I absorbed during the hunger. It was November 15th, 2127, 3 weeks after the structure collapsed. I was standing in what used to be a marketplace in the settlement we'd later rename the Hub, holding a child's toy that I knew I'd never owned, remembering a birthday party I'd never attended, feeling grief for parents who weren't mine. The worst part? I couldn't remember my actual childhood anymore. Those memories had been pushed out, replaced by someone else's life. Someone whose name I'd never know because their identity had dissolved into mine during the merge. That's when I understood what the next 50 years would be. Not recovery, replacement. Every survivor of the Lost Years was fighting the same invisible battle, trying to hold on to whoever they used to be, while the absorbed fragments slowly overwrote their original selves. We called it the aftermath. The structure had fallen, yes, but it left landmines buried in our minds, time bombs set to detonate over decades rather than seconds. Let me tell you about 2127, the year nobody talks about honestly, the year we all agreed to lie, the turn. Brotherhood of Steel emerged from Lost Hills that November, 25 years after sealing themselves in, expecting to find a world rebuilt, or at least rebuilding. What Elder Maxon and his paladins found instead was something they had no protocols for: settlements functioning normally on the surface, but fundamentally broken underneath. People going through the motions of survival, while their minds quietly unraveled from the inside. I watched them arrive in our settlement. Maxon himself, old even then, walked our streets with that characteristic Brotherhood arrogance, ready to catalog and understand the wasteland. Then he talked to us. Really talked, not just surface pleasantries. I still remember his face when he realized something was profoundly wrong. Not radiation sickness, not mutation, not even simple trauma. We were coherent, functional, capable of complex conversation, but we'd all go silent mid-sentence, staring at nothing, accessing memories of conversations we'd never had. The Brotherhood scribes documented everything that first year. The silent zones where groups would gather in circles, standing motionless for hours. The echo speech where survivors repeated dialogues from absorbed minds. The mass graves with empty clothes and no bodies because during the hunger, those people hadn't died. They'd been incorporated into others, leaving behind everything except their physical form. Those records were sealed in 2128 under Elder Protocol 7, classification so extreme that even now, most paladins don't know it exists. You need unanimous council approval to access those archives, and that's never happened because the Brotherhood learned what every other faction learned: some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. Here's what you need to understand about the collapse. It wasn't clean. The structure didn't just switch off. It unraveled over 6 weeks, releasing absorbed consciousnesses in waves. The first wave, in early November 2127, lucky bastards. They remembered their names, recognized family if any survived, could function almost normally. The Brotherhood documented them as mildly traumatized but recoverable. I was third wave, 3 weeks into the collapse. By then, released consciousnesses came back fractured, carrying pieces of other people's memories mixed with their own. I woke up knowing 3 different languages I'd never learned, remembering 2 childhoods that couldn't both be real, feeling phantom pain in a left arm that had never been broken, except it had, just not on my body. The Brotherhood tried to help at first. Scribes attempted to develop treatments, psychological protocols to help survivors separate original memories from absorbed ones. Every method failed. You can't unknow something you remember experiencing. You can't unfeel emotions you genuinely felt, even if you felt them while merged into someone else's consciousness. We weren't suffering from false memories. That was the problem. The memories were real. They just belonged to too many different people. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. By December, settlements across California started implementing what became known as the Don't Ask Protocol, an unspoken agreement. Nobody questions the gaps. Nobody presses survivors about what they can't remember. Nobody acknowledges that the lost years existed. We built an entire social contract around collective amnesia because the alternative was confronting what we'd become, and none of us were strong enough for that. The hub formed in 2132, not as a trading post initially, but as a psychological refuge. Harold was already mutating by then, already forgetting why crowds terrified him. He gathered people who understood the need to maintain individual identity. We started trading not just goods, but techniques for staying separate, keeping personal journals, developing unique habits, creating external proof that we were discrete individuals rather than fragments of a dissolved collective. That's why Wastelanders became so obsessive about personal possessions in those years. It wasn't greed, it was existential necessity. If you owned something unique, something nobody else had, it proved you were still you. The gunrunners understood this instinctively. They started producing weapons with serial numbers, one-of-a-kind modifications, physical proof that distinct objects could still exist when distinct people were becoming questionable. The Master's transformation in 2102 happened before the structure fully activated, but his Unity plan was a direct echo of what almost consumed us all. Richard Gray fell into those vats already damaged by early absorption attempts. His genius-level intellect had been expanded by residual structure programming. When he started talking about making humanity one people, one race, one mind, every ghoul who survived the hunger felt a sickening recognition. We'd already lived through forced unification. His vision wasn't revolutionary, it was a recurring nightmare. The children of the Cathedral, founded in 2156, weren't just cult followers. They were people still carrying fragments of the hunger, unconsciously seeking to rebuild the connection they'd lost. They worshipped unity because they couldn't remember why it terrified the rest of us. Morpheus and his followers had been absorbed and released relatively intact, but they'd experienced enough of the merge to crave it again. The Cathedral became a magnet for anyone who'd gotten addicted to that feeling of dissolution, that escape from the burden of being individual. Here's something nobody talks about. Ghouls don't go feral from radiation alone. That's the lie the Brotherhood tells to make it sound scientific. We go feral when the absorbed consciousnesses we're carrying override our original personality. Every ghoul who survived the lost years carries at least 3 other people's consciousness fragments. I know because I hear them. I remember their childhoods, dream their dreams, feel their emotions. And every year, it gets harder to tell which memories are actually mine. Ask yourself, if you remembered 50 years of life experience, but only 30 of it actually happened to you, which person are you? The one you think you were, or the composite you've become? The vault experiments Vault Tech designed weren't just social experiments. The Enclave on the oil rig had recovered structure data. They'd discovered that isolated populations developed resistance to consciousness absorption. Vault 106's psychoactive drugs weren't recreational. They were attempting to chemically sever the residual connections between survivors and the structure's remains. Created psychosis as a side effect, but successfully prevented reabsorption in 73% of test subjects. By 2140, the Brotherhood had discovered that large gatherings of people created resonance events, temporary reformation of structure like connections that would consume individual minds for hours before dissipating. That's why Elder Maxon ordered settlement populations kept under 200 people, not resource constraints, but because crossing that threshold risked spontaneous unity formation, small-scale absorption events that would wipe out entire communities overnight. I was present when Maxon made that discovery. A settlement called New Hope tried to celebrate their founding with a gathering of 300 people. I watched from the ridgeline as they formed a circle, joined hands for what was supposed to be a simple ceremony, and then just stopped moving. Stood there for 6 hours, breathing in perfect unison, minds temporarily merged. When they separated, 15 people never came back. Their bodies kept functioning, but the original consciousness was gone, dissolved into the others. New Hope became old silence after that. The survivors never spoke about what they experienced during the merge, but they also never gathered in groups larger than 20 again. That's what we learned in those early years. Connection was dangerous. Community was dangerous. Caring about others could literally absorb you into them. So we built a civilization founded on disconnection, isolation, fear of our own humanity. The raiders who reject all community bonds? They're not psychopaths, they're survivors who decided if unity meant death, then complete isolation meant life. They destroyed community to prevent any possibility of merger. And honestly, can you blame them after what we lived through? The super mutant sterility problem the Master couldn't solve wasn't biological. It was consciousness-based. FEV created bodies that could host multiple merged minds, but reproduction requires singular identity. You need 2 separate beings to create a third. Super mutants no longer possessed that fundamental separation. They weren't individuals who'd been changed. They were walking embodiments of forced merger, multiple consciousnesses compressed into enhanced bodies. The Master's entire plan was doomed from the start because he was trying to solve with biology what was actually a problem of consciousness architecture. Marcus and the intelligent mutants retained individuality because they were created from vault dwellers with no structure exposure, pure humans with intact singular consciousness. That's why the Master targeted vaults specifically. He needed uncontaminated minds to create functional unity members, but he never understood why. He just knew empirically that vault dwellers made better super mutants, more intelligent, more stable. The real reason? They were the only humans left who hadn't been partially dissolved by the hunger. Let me tell you about Harold's tree. Bob didn't grow from radiation. In 2135, Harold's body started trying to merge with the landscape itself. His mutation was structure contamination expressing through biology. Bob the tree is a manifestation of consciousness that couldn't stay contained in a single form, trying to spread, to connect, to merge with everything around it. By the time Harold reached the capital wasteland centuries later, Bob had turned him into a living representation of what the structure wanted for all of us. Dissolution of boundaries, merging with environment, becoming part of something larger than individual existence. Harold's tragedy is that he understood what was happening to him. He begged for death because he could feel himself spreading, losing cohesion, becoming the very thing we'd all escaped. The tree-minders who worshipped him couldn't see the horror. They thought he was bringing life to the wasteland. He was, in a sense. But that life was antithetical to individuality, to the discrete existence we'd fought so hard to maintain. The hub's success in those early years came from Harold's leadership and his understanding of what we needed. He'd been present during the Master's transformation, had seen Richard Gray fall into those vats, had experienced his own contamination. Harold knew that survival meant maintaining separation while building enough connection to sustain civilization. It was a razor's edge we had to walk. Too isolated, and humanity dies out. too connected, and humanity dissolves into something else entirely. By 2145, the wasteland had developed a pattern of settlement that looked random but was actually highly structured around the principle of managed separation. Settlements were spaced far enough apart that resonance events couldn't chain between them. Population caps were strictly enforced. Trade caravans became the primary form of connection because moving individuals couldn't create the stable groupings that triggered absorption. We'd learned to exist as a network of islands rather than a continent, and we convinced ourselves it was because of raiders and NMS-5 radiation, not because we were terrified of getting too close to each other. Vault 13's water chip didn't malfunction naturally. The Brotherhood knows this, but won't say it. Someone or something sabotaged it in 2134. I have suspicions about who, but I can't prove it. What I know for certain is that the timing was too perfect. Vault 13 had been sealed since the war. Pristine population with no structure contamination, about to open naturally within 5 years. Instead, the chip fails, forcing them to send someone out early, adding fresh, uncontaminated minds to the gene pool, exactly when survivor reproduction rates were declining because we could barely maintain our own identities, let alone create and raise new ones. The Enclave on the oil rig spent 2130 through 2177 analyzing why the structure failed. Their scientists discovered it wasn't human resistance, but fundamental incompatibility. Our form of consciousness was unsuited to unification. We're not modular like the structure assumed. You can't merge human minds like data files and expect them to maintain integrity. We're not designed to be networked. The Enclave's conclusion: genocide. If humanity couldn't be unified and controlled, it needed to be eliminated and replaced. FEV Curling-13 wasn't designed to kill mutants. It was designed to kill anyone carrying residual structure contamination, anyone whose consciousness had been touched by absorption. By 2236, that was approximately 94% of the surviving human population. The Enclave planned to wipe the slate clean and start over with their pure population, the only humans who'd never been exposed to the hunger because they'd been sealed on the oil rig during the entire event. The followers of the apocalypse, founding in 2170, was built on recovered structure research. Their mission to spread knowledge wasn't academic idealism, it was survival strategy. They'd figured out that consciousness diversity prevented absorption. The more different ways people thought, the less likely minds were to merge. Uniformity was dangerous. Conformity could trigger resonance. So the followers deliberately spread contradictory information, taught different methodologies, encouraged intellectual diversity as a form of inoculation against future absorption events. NCR's obsession with bureaucracy and individual citizenship wasn't political ideology when they formed in 2189. It was survival strategy, maintaining detailed records of separate people with separate identities, written proof that we're still distinct. Every census was an act of defiance against dissolution. Every law that protected individual rights was protection against the pull toward merger that still lived in our contaminated minds. The Brotherhood's obsession with ranks and hierarchy serves the same function, maintaining strict individual identity markers, ensuring no one could lose themselves in collective purpose. Every paladin, every scribe, every initiate had a designation, a role, a place in the hierarchy that marked them as separate. The Brotherhood wasn't just preserving technology, they were preserving the concept of discrete human existence. Notice how no major settlement before 2180 has a central gathering space, how buildings face outward, not inward, how communities are designed to prevent large groups from seeing each other simultaneously. That's not accident, that's survival architecture. We learned to build environments that discouraged the formations that could trigger resonance. Town squares were death traps, amphitheaters were suicide. Any design that encouraged people to focus collective attention could start the cascade toward merger. Jet's invention in the 2170s wasn't about getting high. It was about achieving temporary mental clarity. The drug's effect of slowing time perception actually helped users separate their own thoughts from absorbed memories. For a few hours, You could experience genuine individual consciousness, untainted by the fragments you were carrying. That's why it became so popular so fast. Every survivor craved those moments of being purely themselves again, even if it was chemical and temporary. Death claws were created by the military before the war, but the intelligent ones in Vault 13 weren't just FEV experiments. The Enclave was testing whether non-human consciousness could resist absorption, creating a backup for humanity in case we failed. Think about that. They were so worried about human consciousness being fundamentally flawed for individual existence that they tried to engineer replacement species. The talking death claws were supposed to inherit the Earth if we dissolved ourselves into oblivion. The Institute in Massachusetts sealed itself because they had complete records of the lost years. Their scientists understood that surface humanity was compromised. The synth program wasn't about slavery or replacement paranoia like people think. It was about creating beings with guaranteed singular consciousness. Artificial intelligence that couldn't be absorbed because it wasn't biological consciousness at all. They were trying to build the humans we couldn't be anymore. Truly individual, truly separate, immune to merger. By 21, 73 generations had been born since the hunger ended. These new humans had no direct experience of the structure, no absorbed memories of the lost years. They grew up in a world where everyone over a certain age had memory gaps, went silent sometimes, occasionally spoke in voices that weren't quite their own. The young ones accepted it as normal. They didn't know humanity used to be different, used to be more cohesive, because we'd never told them. We couldn't. How do you explain to your children that you're not entirely the person you appear to be, that a significant percentage of your memories belong to people who dissolved into you? The generation gap that developed wasn't just cultural, it was existential. Young people pushing for larger gatherings, closer communities, the very things that terrified the survivors. We seemed paranoid to them, antisocial, damaged. They were right, but they didn't understand why. We couldn't gather in groups over 200 without risking resonance. They saw superstition where we knew certainty. Some settlements tried to bridge this gap by relaxing the restrictions. Settlements that reached populations of 300, 500, trying to prove the old fears were unfounded. Most of those settlements don't exist anymore. Not destroyed by raiders or radiation, just emptied. When resonance events happened to the newer generation with no resistance, no experience of what to fight against, entire populations would achieve temporary merger and some percentage would never come back. Their consciousness permanently dissolved into the collective experience. The survivors would walk away, abandon the settlement, spread the word, the old ones were right, gatherings are death, stay small, stay separate. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The Master's death in 2162 wasn't just the end of the Unity. It was the death of the last being who fully remembered what the structure felt like, who understood what we'd survived, whose destruction let us finally pretend it never happened. Richard Gray had been absorbed and released in a unique way, transformed rather than just contaminated. He was a living reminder of what forced unification actually meant. When the Vault Dweller killed him, we lost the only consciousness that could have explained what happened to us, because he'd achieved what the structure wanted, perfect merger of multiple minds into enhanced singular existence. The Brotherhood NCR, tensions that developed weren't really about hoarding technology. They were about information control. The Brotherhood knew that widespread education about the lost years would trigger memory recovery in survivors, force people to consciously examine the fragments they carried. That examination could cause psychological breakdown on a large scale, or worse, could trigger spontaneous resonance as people tried to understand and access their absorbed memories, potentially restarting small-scale absorption events. The NCR wanted to document everything, educate everyone, build a knowledge-based society. The Brotherhood wanted to control information, limit education to need-to-know basis, keep dangerous knowledge locked away. Both were trying to protect humanity, they just had different threat models. NCR feared ignorance, leading to repeated mistakes. Brotherhood feared knowledge, triggering the very thing we'd escaped. By 2177, a century after the bombs, we'd managed to convince ourselves the lost years were just confusion and chaos. Memory loss from radiation, gaps from trauma, normal consequences of nuclear war. We built an entire civilization on agreed amnesia because the truth was too complex, too terrifying, too likely to destabilize the fragile peace we'd achieved. We needed to believe we were still human in the traditional sense, not the composite beings we'd actually become. The reason no nation-states reformed until the next CR in 2189 wasn't lack of organization or resources. It was terror. Everyone who remembered the lost years knew that large-scale social unity led to literal unity. Building nations risked building another structure. The very concept of United States or unified peoples triggered visceral fear in survivors. We'd spent decades learning that unity meant death of self, and suddenly young politicians wanted to create federal systems, national identities, collective governance. The NCR's formation was controversial not because of its policies, but because of what it represented. Thousands of people bound by common identity, common purpose, common governance. Every survivor over 50 years old looked at Tandi's vision and saw the hunger wearing a different face. But the younger generation didn't understand our fear. They pushed forward, created the Republic, and we waited for disaster. It didn't come. That's what finally convinced us that maybe we'd actually escaped. The CR grew to tens of thousands of citizens, and no resonance events occurred, no mass absorption, no loss of individual consciousness. The structure's contamination had faded enough that voluntary association no longer triggered forced merger. We could choose to unite without being consumed by unity, but we never forgot the cost of that freedom. NCR bureaucracy isn't inefficiency, it's insurance. Every form, every document, every record is proof of discrete existence. When you've lived through forced merger, you obsessively document separation. The younger generation complains about red tape, not understanding it's a memorial to what we survived, a constant reminder that we're still individuals despite everything. I need to tell you about what happened in 2152, something the Brotherhood sealed away but I witnessed directly. A settlement called Haven tried an experiment. They developed a theory that controlled, voluntary consciousness sharing might be possible. They thought if we could understand and harness what the structure did, we could achieve its benefits, true understanding between people, without the horror of forced dissolution. 30 volunteers participated. They used residual structure technology they'd found, carefully calibrated to create temporary, limited connections between minds. The plan was to share consciousness for exactly 1 hour, then separate, proving that controlled merger was possible. I was there as an observer, along with 2 Brotherhood scribes. We watched from outside the chamber as the 30 linked together. For the first 10 minutes, it seemed to work. They reported experiencing each other's thoughts, feeling true empathy, understanding without words. Then minute 15 hit, and you could see the panic start. They tried to disconnect, but the link had strengthened beyond the controls. By minute 20, several participants were screaming. By minute 30, silence. When we opened the chamber 3 hours later, we found 23 people. Not bodies, people. 7 participants had completely dissolved, absorbed so thoroughly into the others that their physical forms had ceased, just clothes and personal effects left behind. The survivors couldn't explain what happened. They had memories from all 30 participants, couldn't distinguish their original selves from the absorbed fragments. 3 of them went feral within a week. The rest lived maybe another decade before the battle against their absorbed consciousnesses finally overwhelmed them. Haven was abandoned that day. The Brotherhood classified all records. The structure technology was destroyed, and we learned the final lesson: there is no controlled version of what happened to us. You either maintain absolute separation or you risk total dissolution. There's no middle ground, no compromise, no way to have connection without the possibility of consumption. That's why I'm telling you this now, why I'm recording this testimony. Because I'm going feral, not from radiation, from losing the battle against the 7 consciousnesses I absorbed during the hunger. Their voices are getting louder. Their memories are becoming more vivid than my own. I dream exclusively in other people's lives now. I wake up confused about which body I'm supposed to be inhabiting. Last week, I spent 3 hours trying to find my childhood home before I remembered I'd never lived in that town. That was someone else's childhood, someone who dissolved into me in November 21, 27. But the memory feels more real than my actual past because I've accessed it more frequently, reinforced it more strongly. The neural pathways for their memories are deeper than the paths for mine. This is what ferality really is. Not loss of intelligence, but loss of identity coherence. Feral ghouls aren't mindless. We're too mindful, carrying dozens of consciousnesses at once, unable to determine which body is ours, which thoughts are ours, which life we're supposed to be living. We're trapped in a permanent state of the confusion that all survivors felt during the hunger, except we never found our way back to singular existence. The wasteland's culture of extreme individualism wasn't built from necessity or harsh conditions. It was built from trauma. We learned that caring about others could literally dissolve you into them, that empathy could trigger absorption, that love could mean loss of self. So we built a civilization that valorizes isolation, that treats connection as weakness, that sees community as dangerous. Not because we're damaged, but because we learned the truth. For us, for the contaminated survivors, those things actually are dangerous. Every social norm in the wasteland traces back to this. The reluctance to share personal information isn't paranoia, it's protection against creating the mental intimacy that could trigger resonance. The emphasis on individual achievement isn't ego, it's desperate proof of discrete existence. The suspicion of strangers isn't antisocial, it's recognition that any new connection risks absorption. We built an entire culture around the principles necessary to prevent the hunger from returning. The Enclave understood this better than anyone. They watched from the oil rig as we constructed a civilization based on disconnection. They saw how it made us weak, inefficient, unable to coordinate large-scale efforts effectively. Their plan with FEV Curling-13 wasn't just genocide, it was mercy killing in their eyes. They thought humanity as we'd become wasn't worth preserving. Better to wipe us out and start fresh with their pure population than let the contaminated survivors limp along in our broken state. They were wrong, but I understand why they thought it. Looking at wasteland civilization from the outside, we do seem broken. We can't gather, we can't trust, we can't build the great works that defined pre-war humanity. We're scattered, isolated, suspicious, constantly fighting just to maintain our individual existence. From a certain perspective, we're already dead, just shambling corpses of what humanity used to be. But they missed what we gained. We survived something no other humans ever faced. We learned to value individual consciousness in ways pre-war people never did because they never had to fight to keep it. Every day that a survivor maintains their identity is a victory. Every settlement that stays coherent without dissolving into resonance is a triumph. We're not broken, we're adapted. Evolution in action. The Master saw this too, in his way. His unity wasn't about destroying humanity. It was about completing what he thought we'd started. He believed the structure's gift was interrupted, that we were meant to transcend individual existence entirely. In his merged consciousness, he'd experienced something beyond normal human understanding. He wanted to share that. To elevate all of humanity to his level, he genuinely believed he was saving us from the burden of separation. He couldn't understand that we'd experienced what he was offering and chose to escape it, that we'd rather struggle as individuals than exist peacefully as fragments of a collective. That consciousness isolation was the victory, not the problem to be solved. His death meant the death of that philosophy, the final rejection of forced unity as humanity's future. The children of the Cathedral collapsed with him because their entire worldview was built on longing for merger. When the Master died, when the unity failed, they had to confront that what they craved was actually the thing that had nearly destroyed all of humanity. Some accepted this and integrated into wasteland society, learning to value separation. Others couldn't bear it and took their own lives, unable to exist in a world where permanent isolation was necessary. I met one of the surviving children in 2175. She'd been a high priestess, fully committed to the Unity's vision. After the Master's death, she'd spent years trying to understand what went wrong. When I told her about the lost years, about the hunger, about what the structure did, she wept, not from sadness but from understanding. She'd been worshipping the thing that almost killed us all, and she'd never known. The Master had never told his followers about the structure, had kept the true history hidden even from his most devoted servants. She asked me why we didn't tell everyone, why we maintained the collective amnesia. I didn't have a good answer then, and I still don't now. Maybe because the truth is too complex. Maybe because understanding might trigger the very thing we're trying to prevent. Maybe because we're cowards who can't face what we've become. Probably all three. Here's what I can tell you with certainty. The lost years didn't end when the structure collapsed in 2127. They ended in 2177, when the last direct witnesses either died or went feral. When everyone who remembered singular human consciousness from before the hunger was gone, replaced by people who only knew the contaminated version we'd become. The younger generation thought our isolation and suspicion were character flaws, not survival necessities. They didn't remember what it felt like to be truly, completely, individually yourself. I'm one of the last witnesses, maybe the last who can still speak coherently. Most others went feral decades ago. A few might still exist, scattered across the wasteland, but we don't seek each other out. Being around other survivors triggers memories of the hunger. We can feel the residual contamination in each other, the absorbed fragments pulling toward resonance. It's safer to stay separate, to let the knowledge die with us, but I can't. I need someone to know what really happened, why the wasteland is the way it is, why we built a civilization on disconnection, why we can't gather in large numbers, why we're terrified of unity, not because we're broken people, but because we're survivors of something that tried to break us in a very specific way. And the adaptations that kept us alive look like dysfunction to anyone who doesn't know the context. The Brotherhood will probably destroy this recording. They've spent a century suppressing this information, maintaining the agreed amnesia, but maybe one copy survives. Maybe someone hears this and understands. Maybe the truth is worth preserving, even if it's dangerous. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this testimony will trigger exactly what we feared, cause people to examine their absorbed fragments, start the cascade toward new resonance events. Maybe I'm the danger, the last connection to the hunger, and my ferality is justice for keeping these secrets. I don't know anymore. The voices are too loud now. 7 people talking at once inside my head. I'm losing the ability to tell which one is supposed to be me. Soon, I'll go fully feral, and none of it will matter. I'll be all of them equally, and none of them specifically. Just another shambling reminder of what we survived, what we became, what we're still fighting every single day. The next 50 years, after 2127, were about learning to live as ghosts of who we used to be. Every survivor developed their own coping mechanisms, their own ways of maintaining the illusion of singular identity. Some kept obsessive journals, writing down which memories were real versus absorbed. Others created elaborate personal mythologies, stories about themselves that they'd repeat constantly to reinforce a consistent narrative. I knew one man who tattooed his entire life story on his body, adding to it every year, creating a physical record he could reference when he couldn't remember which experiences were actually his. None of it worked perfectly. You can't journal away memories that feel completely authentic. You can't narrate yourself into coherence when 7 different narratives are competing for dominance. But the efforts mattered because they were proof we were still trying. As long as we fought to maintain individual identity, we hadn't completely surrendered to what the structure made us. The settlements that thrived in those decades were the ones that understood this instinctively. Junktown's success came from Killmaster's enforcement of strict individualism. His rules seemed arbitrary to outsiders, but they were actually carefully designed to prevent the social formations that could trigger resonance. No gatherings over 50 people, no synchronized activities, no collective rituals or ceremonies. Everything that builds community in normal societies was banned because, for us, community building was dangerous. The followers of the apocalypse figured out the opposite approach. Instead of preventing connection, they weaponized diversity. They deliberately recruited people from as many different backgrounds as possible, encouraged contradictory beliefs, taught multiple competing philosophies simultaneously. The theory was that consciousness diversity created interference patterns that prevented resonance. If everyone's thinking differently enough, minds can't achieve the synchronization needed for merger. It worked, mostly. The followers maintained some of the largest stable populations in the wasteland without triggering absorption events. But there was a cost. Followers' settlements were chaotic, argumentative, full of conflict. Constant disagreement was the price of staying separate. They'd traded harmony for existence, which was the right choice, but it made their communities exhausting to live in. Most people couldn't handle it long term. You'd spend a few years with the followers, learning their techniques, then leave for smaller, quieter settlements where you could rest without constantly fighting to maintain cognitive distinctiveness. I spent time with them in 2158, learned their methods, studied their research on the structure. That's how I know what I know, why I can explain this coherently despite carrying 7 consciousnesses. The followers taught me techniques for maintaining identity boundaries, for keeping the absorbed fragments contained. Without that training, I'd have gone feral decades ago. But even their best techniques are failing now. The absorbed consciousnesses aren't separate anymore. They've been integrating with my original self for 150 years. It's like 7 different colors of paint swirling together. At first, you could distinguish each color, keep them somewhat separate. But after enough time, they blend into something new. I'm not me plus 7 others anymore. I'm the composite that emerged from mixing 8 people together. And that composite is unstable, incoherent, unable to maintain singular existence. This is what the structure wanted, I think. Not forced merger, but gradual integration. If the hunger had continued another year, we wouldn't have stayed separate consciousnesses trapped together. We'd have blended into new composite beings, and those composites would have blended with others, and eventually, humanity would have become something entirely different. Not human minds in human bodies, but something larger, more diffuse, spread across multiple bodies, or perhaps transcending physical form entirely. The Master achieved this in miniature. His merged consciousness wasn't Richard Gray anymore, wasn't the people he'd absorbed, wasn't the computer he'd linked with. He was something new that emerged from combining all those elements. He was genuinely more than the sum of his parts, with capabilities no individual consciousness possessed. His vision across the wasteland, his ability to coordinate supermutants telepathically, his philosophical insights, all emergent properties of merged consciousness. He was proof that the structure's vision could work, that merger didn't have to mean death of self, but could mean transcendence to something greater. But he was also proof of why we were right to resist, because that transcendence required sacrificing everything we considered essential to human existence. Individual choice, personal identity, the ability to disagree, to change your mind, to be wrong and learn from it. The Master couldn't be convinced he was wrong because he contained too many perspectives simultaneously. He'd thought through every counter-argument from every angle and synthesized them all into his unified worldview. When the Vault Dweller showed him proof that supermutants were sterile, that the Unity couldn't reproduce, the Master couldn't adapt. A normal human would update their beliefs, change strategy, find a new approach. But the Master's merged consciousness had invested too much in the current path. Too many absorbed minds committed to the vision. Changing course would require internal conflict on a scale that would tear his composite consciousness apart, so he chose death instead. Not from despair, but from recognition that he'd become too unified to survive being wrong. That's the ultimate horror of consciousness merger. You don't just lose individual identity, you lose individual adaptability. You become like a massive ship that can't change direction quickly. In a stable environment, that's fine. But in the wasteland, where conditions change constantly, where survival requires rapid adaptation, merged consciousness is a death sentence. The master was more intelligent than any human, but he was less adaptable, and adaptability matters more than intelligence in the post-war world. We survivors understood this instinctively, even if we couldn't articulate it. Staying separate wasn't just about preserving human tradition or clinging to outdated concepts of selfhood. It was about maintaining the flexibility necessary for survival. Every absorbed fragment reduced our ability to change, to grow, to respond to new information. We had to stay as singular as possible just to keep functioning in an unpredictable environment. By 2200, most settlements had developed elaborate social rituals designed to reinforce individual identity while allowing necessary cooperation. Traders would introduce themselves with increasingly detailed personal histories, establishing their distinctness before conducting business. Communities held separation ceremonies where everyone would spend time alone, physically isolated, to reset any resonance that might be building. Even simple greetings became longer, more personal, because establishing individual identity was the first step in any interaction. To outsiders, we seemed obsessed with ourselves, narcissistic, unable to think collectively. But we weren't being self-centered, we were being self-protective. Every emphasis on individual difference was armor against dissolution. Every personal quirk we cultivated was a lifeline back to singular existence. We weren't celebrating individuality for its own sake. We were desperately clinging to it as the only thing standing between us and the hunger's return. The younger generations born after 2177 didn't understand this context. They saw the rituals as empty tradition, the isolation as antisocial behavior, the emphasis on individuality as selfish. They pushed back, tried to create more connected, more communal societies. Sometimes it worked. The CR's success proved that humans born without structure contamination could form large-scale societies without risking resonance. But survivors couldn't participate fully in those societies. We had to maintain our distance, our separation, our elaborate identity rituals, even when they seemed unnecessary to everyone else. This created a permanent division in wasteland society. The contaminated survivors and their immediate descendants who knew the dangers of connection, and the new humans who could connect freely, who thought our fears were superstition, who saw our isolation as trauma response rather than survival necessity. Both groups were right from their own perspectives. Connection was dangerous for us and safe for them. The tragedy was that we couldn't explain why without revealing the truth about the lost years, and revealing that truth might trigger the very resonance events we were trying to prevent. I've watched this division deepen over the decades. Watched as survivor culture became increasingly separate from mainstream wasteland society. We formed our own communities, our own trade networks, our own support systems for people fighting to maintain singular consciousness. The younger generations called us the old separated, meant as an insult, but we embraced it. Yes, we're separated. That's the point. That's how we survive. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. Now in 2277, 200 years after the bombs, I'm one of maybe a dozen survivors still coherent enough to remember the truth. The others went feral or died decades ago. I've outlasted them not through strength but through luck and followers' training. But my time is ending. The voices are overwhelming now. I spent this morning convinced I was a woman named Sarah, lived her whole childhood, felt her fear when the bombs fell, experienced her absorption during the hunger. It was hours before I remembered I'm not Sarah, she's just one of the fragments I carry. That's happening more frequently. I'll lose entire days to other people's lives, living their memories as if they're happening now. The barriers between consciousnesses are dissolving. Soon there won't be enough of my original self left to maintain coherence. I'll become like the feral ghouls you see shambling through the wasteland, experiencing 8 lives simultaneously, unable to distinguish between them, trapped in permanent confusion. The wasteland's greatest secret isn't that the bombs fell, or that Vault-Tec ran experiments, or that the Master nearly conquered California. It's that we survived something worse than all of those. Something that tried to erase the very concept of we and I, and that we only escaped by agreeing never to remember it. The entire civilization you see around you, all its quirks and dysfunction and seemingly irrational fears, is built on trauma we refuse to acknowledge. Maybe that's the right choice. Maybe the agreed amnesia is what allowed humanity to continue. If we'd confronted the truth, tried to process what happened, we might have triggered new resonance events, might have discovered that we're too damaged to maintain singular consciousness long term, might have learned that the structure won, just slowly, that all of us are gradually dissolving into the composite beings we were meant to become. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the contamination faded more than I think. Maybe the younger generations really are free of the hunger's influence. Maybe they can build the connected, unified society that was impossible for us. Maybe humanity's future doesn't have to be shaped by our trauma. That's my hope, anyway, as I feel myself slipping away. When you see a feral ghoul, remember this: we're not mindless. We're carrying too many minds, experiencing too many lives, fighting battles you can't see against enemies you can't comprehend. We're the cost of humanity's survival, the casualties of a war most people don't know was fought. We're warnings about what connection without boundaries leads to, and we're proof that consciousness, singular human consciousness, is fragile and precious and worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. The lost years didn't end when the structure collapsed. They didn't end when the last witnesses died. They won't end until the last contaminated survivor finally goes feral and the truth dies with us. This recording is my attempt to prevent that, to preserve the knowledge of what we survived and what it cost us. Use it wisely. Learn from our mistakes. Value your individual consciousness because you don't know how easily it can be taken away. I'm going feral now. I can feel it. The 8 voices merging into one confused chorus. Soon I won't remember which life is mine. Won't remember recording this testimony. Won't remember anything except the eternal present of multiple lives being lived simultaneously. The hunger will finally claim its last victim, not through absorption but through the slow dissolution of identity boundaries that has been happening since the day the structure touched my mind. This is how the lost years end. Not with apocalypse or revelation, but with quiet dissolution. One consciousness at a time, losing coherence until we're all just fragments of who we used to be, shambling through the wasteland, carrying the weight of multiple lives we can no longer distinguish between. The structure may have fallen, but it won. In the end, it just took 200 years to finish what it started. My name is, I don't remember. I'm Sarah, and Marcus, and Diana, and 4 others whose names have dissolved into the chorus. We are the last testament to the hunger, the final warning about what humanity barely escaped. Remember us? Remember what we sacrificed. Remember that staying separate, staying yourself, staying singular is victory enough in a world that tried so hard to merge us all into something else. The voices are too loud now. I can't distinguish, can't maintain. The recording ends here. The truth ends here. The lost years finally, truly end here, with the last coherent voice falling silent, joining the eternal chorus of the feral, the dissolved, the consumed. We are the cost. We are the warning. We are the lost years made flesh. And we are finally, mercifully ending.